So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest speakers for the evening, Mark and Jake Romanack.
I think it's going to be just Mark Romanack. If I'm not mistaken, you got Jake coming a little later in the season.
I'm sorry.
So, wow, what a crowd. Holy smokes. So, yeah, welcome. Well, if you haven't had a chance to meet me, my name is, of course, Mark Romanack, and I produce a little fishing show called Fishing 411. We broadcast nationally on the Sportsman's Channel and also World Fishing Network. So if you've got a cable package or a satellite package, probably a pretty good chance that you've have seen the show, or you can see it there. If you don't have that and you're looking for another place to watch the show, I'd recommend YouTube. It seems like everybody these days is dialed into YouTube, and of course, we have a YouTube channel as well. All the episodes that are broadcasting right now are going to be on YouTube starting about the 1st of April. So you might have to be a little patient to watch the current stuff, but eventually you can watch all that stuff absolutely free on YouTube. I got a couple family members here I'd like to draw some attention to. I'd like to always embarrass my lovely wife, Mary, who puts up with an awful lot of stuff with us traveling. She's one of the partners in our business, and of course Jake is here. You've seen him from the Fishing 411 show as well. He's one of our co-hosts. We also have another member that is not here, Gabe Van Warmer, who is part of Fishing 401. He's our videographer, and he's also our editor as well. So I hope right now he's busy editing television shows, because that's what I pay him to do. So I would expect he'll do that. The seminar we're going to do tonight is going to be a little different than what we usually do. The club got a hold of me and they wanted me to do some different things, and so I kind of customized the seminar just especially for you folks here tonight. They wanted me to talk a little bit about precision trolling, a company I've been involved in for a very long time. They want to talk a little bit about where it came from and where it's going. Then they asked if I could talk about some of the fundamentals of walleye fishing, some of the things I think every walleye fisherman should know about, some presentations that are critically important to them. And then they also wanted me to close out with talking about where is walleye fishing going in the future? Where do I see things, moving forward? And I think by the time we cover that ground, we'll have run out of time. But last but not least, before I get into doing the seminar, a couple of comments I'd like to make. I look around, I see a lot of familiar faces, but more importantly, I see some young faces. And that is a cool thing. Both Jake and I have made a conscious note that in doing club seminars over the years, typically we don't see young people. Typically we see people my age is what we see. It really is a breath of fresh air to look around and see you got some nice young folks in this audience, and that's a good thing. It isn't going to survive without them. And the other thing I'd like to point out, and having dinner with Tim tonight, I realize you folks are still an affiliate of Michigan United Conservation Clubs. God bless you. That's what it really is required. There's a lot of fishing clubs, a lot of hunting clubs, a lot of outdoor clubs who are not supporting Michigan United Conservation Clubs. We will not survive in the long run if we don't work together, if we don't have one voice. So again, God bless you for doing that. It's good work that you're doing, and it's a thing that's going to keep this fishery going good and the sports that we enjoy productive for the future. So I'm going to hit the button here. We're going to start this pretty quick. The first thing is basically just our opening to our show. That's the commercialism. Then after that, there's going to be about a 5-minute video or so that talks a little bit about precision trolling, how we do what we do. And then after that, we'll get into some question and answers. I'll flesh it out, and I'm hoping y'all have a great time. Jake, want to hit the button? Wow, this is absolutely stellar.
What a gorgeous fish. We're going to get a quick picture for Facebook, and then she's going back to do some spawning.
Well, just about everyone who's spent any time trolling has come to the conclusion that crankbaits are great lures for catching fish. We all agree on that. But the problem with crankbaits is you just can't look at one and tell how deep it dives. And even the manufacturers are not a lot of help here, because manufacturers don't have the luxury of testing their crankbaits to determine exactly how deep they dive. And that's what precision trolling data is all about. What we do is go out on the water and we control all the variables, with the idea being to determine exactly how deep a crankbait will dive based on some very important variables, things like lead length and also line diameter. You know, there's a lot of factors that influence how deep a crankbait is going to dive, but the primary factors, the things you got to be really concerned with, are things like line diameter. Thinner lines allow crankbaits to dive deeper than what thicker lines would. The other thing you have to be concerned with is what we call lead length or feet back. And the further you put a crankbait back behind the boat, the deeper it's naturally going to dive. So if you control those two variables, you can very well predict exactly how deep a crankbait is going to go below the surface. So essentially at Precision Trolling Data, what we do is we troll crankbaits past a scuba diver who's determining exactly how deep they're going below the surface. It's really quite that simple, but it's a little bit more complex than that. What I mean about complexities is that everybody doesn't fish exactly the same type of line or the same diameter line, and so what we're obligated to do is to test a variety of different line types and line diameters. What that does is it gives fishermen a fighting chance of knowing how deep a lure is going to go on exactly the type of gear they're likely to be fishing with.
14.3, 143.
14.3, good number. You know, when it comes to line types, we typically use both braid and monofilament for testing these lures. If a lure happens to be something that would be applicable to, say, walleye fishing, a 10-pound test monofilament is going to be a really good choice. Or we might also do 10-4 braid, 10-pound test, 4-pound diameter braid. But what if a bait is used for something else, like maybe a salmon lure would be typically trolled on more heavier lines? So then in that case, we would more likely use something like 20-pound test monofilament. So all of the data that we collect at Precision Trolling Data ultimately ends up in a phone app. Now, of course, a phone app is going to be the ideal way for people to get this information and be able to use it on the water. The beauty of a phone app is that once the information is loaded to your phone, you don't even need a cell coverage to use it. As long as the battery is good on your phone, you can look up all the information you need to determine how deep your favorite crankbaits are diving below the surface. You know, one of the other things that Precision Trolling Data does is it kind of debunks some theories out there. For example, a lot of people believe that trolling speed influences how deep a crankbait dives. Actually, that's not true at all. Floating diving style crankbaits, which are typically used in the industry, are not speed dependent. What I mean by that is that you control them a variety of different speeds and they still go to the same depth. Now, speed does have some changes. It changes the action of a lure. If you speed up, the action of the lure is going to be more aggressive. If you slow down, the action is going to be deadened a little bit. But speed does not determine how deep a crankbait dives below the surface. So while it's interesting that speed really doesn't matter in terms of how deep a floating diving crankbait is going to go, speed does matter in other regards. For example, if a lure that you're using or a device that you're trolling with sinks, if it's negatively buoyant, speed makes a big difference. And in that case, the slower you go, the deeper a device is going to fish. The faster you go, the more higher in the water column it's going to typically run. So if a device sinks, we test them at speeds and then we post that speed on the app. So if you don't see a speed, it's because it's not necessary or not relevant to that particular device. So at Precision Trolling Data, we actually come by our name naturally. Essentially what we're doing is we're using as much precision as is humanly possible to control all the variables so that when we put things in the water and troll them, we can determine exactly how deep they dive. Now, how close do we measure? Literally, right down to the inch. So at Precision Trolling Data, we started our company testing crankbaits, but these days we test just about anything a guy would troll with. No matter what you're fishing with, whether it's a crankbait, a snap weight, a dip sea diver, lead core line, copper line, no matter what you're fishing with, we've probably tested it at Precision Trolling Data. We've been testing crankbaits and other trolling gear for about 25 years. In the early days, we published our data in a book. But these days, it's much more appropriate to put that data in a phone app. And the reason for that is we can update an app very, very quickly and a much more convenient way for people to use the data. So if you're looking for Precision Trolling Data these days, you're looking for it in a phone app. Okay, well, what I'll do is I'll give you just a little bit of a brief history about precision trolling. Most people associate me with the company, and I understand why that is. I've been around a very long time, and I've been promoting this company for a long time, but I wasn't the originator of precision trolling. It actually got started by a couple of guys named Dr. Steve Holt and Tom Irwin. I don't know if you ever had the pleasure of meeting these guys. Dr. Holt was my tournament partner. When I fished the MWC and also on the Michigan Walleye Tour some years ago, Dr. Holt was my tournament partner. Tom Irwin was a charter captain. And how this got started was Dr. Holt had booked Tom Irwin for a charter. You take him out and they were doing some fishing, they were doing some crankbait trolling. Well, Dr. Holt, being an intuitive kind of guy, was curious about how he was determining how deep the lures were going. And at the time, they weren't really determining how deep they're going. They're just kind of letting out line, and then eventually you feel it hit the bottom. You know, you let out enough, and then you reel up a little bit more. Wasn't very sophisticated. Well, the cool thing is at the time, Dr. Holt was a licensed scuba diver. And because he was a scuba diver, an intelligent guy as well, you know, a forward thinker, and he had the means, the financial means, the two of those guys got together and they created the first precision trolling book, but it wasn't called Precision Trolling. It was called Crankbaits in Depth. It was just a little flip chart is all it was. And it had about 25 baits in it. And so they did their best to try to sell it. The problem was they were really good at what they were doing as far as for understanding what they needed to accomplish with crankbaits, but they weren't very good at marketing, and it really wasn't selling. About 2 years went by, and they hardly sold any of the books at all. So they came to me about that time and said, Mark, we need some assistance here. Would you be willing to get involved from a marketing standpoint to try to see if they could get more people to know about what they'd accomplished? Well, to me, it was a no-brainer. I looked at what they had accomplished. As a fisherman, I'm like, this is invaluable. I mean, everybody's going to want one of these books. And so I started working with them in a marketing concept. And it only took about 2 years to grow the company from about 0 book sales to about 5,000. And as luck would have it, the way this worked out is right about that time, Tom Irwin went through a divorce. And unfortunately, any of you who have ever been through a divorce, you know that financially ruins your life for a period of time. And so there was my opportunity. Tom was getting out of the business because he didn't have the financial means to be there. And I had the financial means to buy into the company, and that's exactly what happened. So that's, you know, it ends up becoming Dr. Holt and Mark become partners. And we were partners for a very, very long time. Not only were we tournament fishermen, close friends, but we did all the diving together, did all of the early studies together, did all the early testing together. And it worked out really, really good until eventually what happened is Steve decided to take a different course in his career. Everybody called Steve Dr. Steve. He was an emergency medical technician, basically a chop suey doctor that worked in the emergency room. I don't know if you know anything about that lifestyle, people burn out. They burn out big time. And he was tired of that. He wanted out of that style of medicine. And he got offered an opportunity to do, of all things, I look around here, probably got some customers, hair replacement surgery. Well, if you wonder which was more lucrative, hair replacement surgery was way more lucrative. So Steve became very busy very quickly in hair replacement, and as a result, he just didn't have the time to dedicate to precision trolling to doing what we were doing. So basically what it boiled down to is we had a difficult decision to make. Steve couldn't do the diving anymore, you know, and so we knew we had to make some other kinds of changes. So I stepped up at that point, and that's when I purchased the company outright and purchased it from Steve, and then we hired a new diver to do the work, and then progressed forward from that point. So that's how I ended up becoming the sole owner of Precision Trolling. But it's not that way currently. We did that for a while when we were producing books, but then when this whole concept of phone apps started being bantered around, it was a few years before we were ready to go from books to phone apps. But when that started being bantered around and that became a real possibility, it was abundantly obvious that Mary and I did not have the financial means to go out and finance a phone app on our own. If you're not familiar with how expensive phone apps are to produce, they're godly expensive. I mean, it is amazing how much money it costs these days to create a phone app. And so we needed financial support. So we needed partners. And that's when we partnered with more family members. I don't know if you realize it or not, but my wife Mary, her brother is Gary Parsons. Okay, my other brother-in-law is Keith Cavallas, a couple of major names in the walleye world. And these guys were familiar with our research. They knew what was going on. They knew it was valuable. And when we approached them and said, dude, we need some help here financially, they were both in immediately. And that's where it currently is today. It's a 4-way partnership, myself, my wife Mary, Gary Parsons, and Keith Cavallas. Those are the people who are behind Precision Trolling currently. I believe we started with the app about 2012, so we're about 8 or so years into the app, and each year the app is growing exponentially. If you'd have told me back then when we started this that that the app would far exceed book sales, I wouldn't have necessarily believed it. I always tell people I had this reoccurring nightmare when I sold books. I had a nightmare that I would wake up in the morning and I'd realize that everybody bought a book and no one's going to buy another one. So your revenue stream is done. Well, now I have a different nightmare. I wake up in the morning and I worry that everybody's bought the app and everybody has got the lifetime version, and I'll be supplying data for you all the rest of my life, but no one will ever buy anymore. But that's not what's happening. Apparently, we have only scratched the tip of the iceberg in terms of people who are interested in this data. We may have saturated to some degree the Great Lakes region, folks like you all here in this room, and people who are familiar with this area and what's going on here, but there are people trolling crankbaits all over the United States. And so we haven't even come close to reaching the potential there. So that's kind of an overview of where it's gone. I got a kind of a cute, look at that picture of me. I actually had, black hair at one point in my life. Believe it or not, I actually had black hair. That's a young Mark Romanack from the mid 1980s. Jake, want to hit the next slide? So let's talk a little bit about where precision trolling is going. We've tested to date about 850 crankbaits, or 850 devices. That's a long ways from the 25 that we started with, an awful long ways. But these days, we're focusing on some different things. Now, certainly there's new crankbaits that are going to hit the market, and in a year like this year, we had a couple really important lures come out. 2 lures hit the market this year that everybody in this room will want to own, and everybody in this room will own at some point in time. Rattles came out with a larger version of the Husky Jerk. They call it the Husky Jerk 14, the Deep Husky Jerk 14. Very effective bait, no question about it. Everybody that trolls walleye in this part of the world will own one. So we had to get those tested. The other one was the Reef Runner 44 Mag. Did anybody see that coming? So I knew about it because I knew that I've known Scott Steckert for a long time at Reef Runner. He showed me the prototype, so I knew it was coming. But I didn't realize how excited people would get about that bait. And so that was another one that we had to get tested. But there's other ones that we tested. But these days, it's not just about testing crankbaits for us. It's about testing some more sophisticated things. For example, speed control and weight systems in combination with crankbaits. What am I talking about? If you've got the app, you're probably familiar with something called the 50+2 method. It's where you take a crankbait, let it out 50 foot. You put a snap weight, 2 ounce on the line, and let out additional weight to get that crankbait to deeper depths. And you're saying, well, why is that important? It's important because it allows a guy to take a crankbait to a depth that he might not otherwise have been able to get it. But more importantly, it allows us to shorten our lead lengths exponentially. So we can get to the fish with less line out. And why is that important? Because the further you got to reel a walleye to get him to the boat, the bigger the chance he's not going to make it to the landing net. It's just that simple. So this whole weight system thing has taken off more than we could have ever dreamed possible. People have been fishing snap weights for a long time, but now they're fishing them with precision. You take our data, combine it to your favorite crankbaits, and now you know exactly how deep your lure is diving. In the old days, guys would put out a lure 20 foot, put a snap weight on it, put out some more line. You heard people talking about it. What did you catch that one on? A 20-20. What's that mean? Well, it means he let the lure out 20 foot, put a snap weight on, let 20 more feet of line out. So he caught fish on it, but the problem is he had not a clue where it was running in the water column. So with the 50+2 method, we can tell you exactly where the bait is running in the water column. So if you're not catching fish on a certain presentation, you can have confidence it's not because the baits aren't in the right place, it's because the fish are not reacting to the bait. They want a different action, they want a different color, but you know that your depth is precise. So we're putting a lot of effort in there. The first 50+2 baits were 16 baits, I believe we came out with initially. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Jake, I think we got another 6 or 8 new ones this year?
I think there's 24 total.
24 total, okay. So now we got a 24 total that if you haven't seen yet, you'll be seeing very, very soon. So gradually we would expect to get that up to about 50 lures probably. And believe me, 50 lures doesn't sound like very many, but I'm willing to bet if I went through all of your tackle boxes, you're probably all fishing with about 6 to 12 different baits, is what most of us in this part of the world are fishing with. Now, if you're like me, I own every single bait that's ever been produced, but a lot of them get real dusty. They don't see action very often anymore. So the next thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is something we expanded into is jig trolling, and we're doing this in 2 capacities. We're doing it for crappie fishermen. Did you know there are 6 times more crappie fishermen in America than there are walleye fishermen? There's a lot of crappie fishermen out there. And the preponderance, the most popular way that they catch fish is by trolling jigs, but they won't call it trolling. Crappie fishing, that's a dirty word. If you're ever south of the Mason-Dixon line, you can't say trolling. Trolling's a dirty word. You have to call it pulling. Okay, they call it pulling. They won't say trolling, okay, but they will say pulling. And so essentially what they're doing is taking a small jig, a crappie-sized jig, pulling it straight up behind the back of the boat, no planer boards, no nothing, just long lining straight out the back, and they catch millions of fish doing this. They have no clue where their jigs are in the water column, but we do. And so we've tested all the common sizes of crappie jigs, and that data is widely available now, and we'll actually be producing an app specially for crappie fishermen to try to target that market as well. The other thing that's new a little bit here is that we've been doing some jig trolling for walleyes. Now, I know a few of you guys that are tournament fishermen probably are already dialed into this, but if you're not into the tournament thing, you may have missed the fact that the next big thing in walleye fishing isn't going to happen with a crankbait, it's going to happen with a jig, and it's going to happen with people who are actually trolling jigs. Well, if you know anything about trolling the jig, you know that it's very, very tricky to get it to the specific depth. It's all about speed, it's all about lead length, it's all about line diameter. And we've been able to isolate those variables and create some very, very interesting data that I think people are going to love as well. And then, believe it or not, we're going to back up in time and we're going to produce a precision casting app. Does anybody ever see the precision trolling book? Not maybe about 5 hands. It's about how many books I sold. Precision casting did not sell very well. We produced precision casting with the idea that we were going to get rich quick selling it to bass fishermen. Apparently they don't pay much attention to what we do because we did not do very well with precision casting. It was a product ahead of its time. In other words, it was a dive curve that told you how deep a crankbait would go if you casted it and reeled it back to the boat. These days, bass fishermen are a lot more sophisticated, and fishermen in general are a lot more sophisticated. So we're going to do a version of precision casting aimed at bass market and see if we can't finally attack that bass market. How about some questions before we move on? You just rose, I thought you raised your hand there. You were just adjusting the camera. You got to be, you scratch your ear or anything around here, you're in trouble. You're going to get called on. Yes, sir.
Okay, in the app, the precision trolling. So then each lure, you pay for the lure you want, and then you download it. That's how it works?
Correct. There's a variety of ways that you can buy the data, and the simplest way, and what we still recommend to people, is just to a la carte it. Let's say you have 6 favorite crankbaits that you troll, and you're interested in knowing the diving depth on those 6 baits. Each one of those lures is going to cost you $1.99. You get a $12 investment. So for a very modest amount of money, you've got all the data you want. Loads to your phone, you have it forever. You never have to buy it again. If you change phones, you can load it to your new phone. If you change phones 5 times, you can load it to 5 different phones. If you want to put it on your iPad, you can put it on your iPad. If you want to put it on your tablet, you can put it on your tablet, depending on what phone platform you have. The only thing you can't do with an app, and this is indicative of not just my app, but everybody's app, is you can't transfer phone platforms. You can't take an app from an iPhone and transfer it to an Android, and you can't take an Android app and transfer it to an iPhone. So that's the only thing that you can't do with it. But other than that, that's the one way you can buy it. The other way that people will purchase it is what they call the lifetime app, and that's more expensive. That's $110. But essentially what that is all of our data that we have to date, you own it. Any data we create in the future, you get it at no additional cost. And that is becoming one of our more popular options. And that's the one that makes me not sleep well at night, because at some point in time, I'm going to be supplying data to a whole bunch of people, and they're not paying for the information anymore. But ultimately, I think that's a long ways off. So you can also buy versions of the app, which is basically all the lures that were tested to date. But I discourage people from buying versions, because a version cannot be updated. Once you bought a version, you own it. Kind of like when you bought a book, you owned it. It couldn't be updated. Yes, sir.
Jig trolling, did you do that with both soft plastics and bucktails, or?
The jig trolling was done with what I would call swim baits. Jig heads with what I would call paddle tails, or a lot of people call swim baits. That's kind of the direction that people are going. And if you think about it, a jig with a paddle tail on it is very similar in profile to a crankbait. It's got a lot of this wobble and tail wiggle that's, it's enticing to fish. We did not do it with bucktails. I don't know that it couldn't be done with bucktails. If there was some interest in that, I think that we could do that quite easily. But that's not where we started. I guess I want to see where this is going to go. I want to see how many apps people buy. And then the cool thing about an app is that I can see precisely the products that people buy. And so I know what's popular and what we should expand in, and I know what's not popular and what lures or what devices not to test. Yes, sir.
What size swim baits did you test?
We did 1/8 ounce, 1/4 ounce, 3/8 ounce, and 1/2 ounce to date. And eventually those will go up to the bigger sizes, the 3/4 and the 1 ounce as well. But we haven't gotten there yet. But the smaller sizes we have got accomplished now. Yes, sir.
for your walleye jig trolling, do you take into account current velocity?
Current? No.
Velocity.
No, we can't do that, and this is the problem. Current is a variable that we cannot control. It's constantly going up, it's constantly going down. All of our data is created in dead, still water where we can control the variables. We can control the lead length, we can control the line diameter, we can control the boat speed, we can control the size of the device, or the lure that we're using. But when you mix in current, like the St. Clair River or the Detroit River, that's not happening. So this jig trolling phenomenon is not going to be something that's going to be something that's done in rivers. It's going to be something that's done out on the big pond and the Great Lakes is where you're going to see guys doing it. Yes, sir?
I don't have unlimited data on my phone. Is it going to use
No.
data?
No, because what happens when you purchase the app, it's uploaded to the memory of your phone, so it's not using any of your data. That's one of the more common questions. The other common questions is, I don't have cell service in many places I fish. Will I be able to use the data? Yeah, because it's not, you don't need cell coverage. All you need is it uploaded to the memory of your phone. Like I said, once it's in a device of your phone, it's there forever. It's not doing anything. I mean, it's not eating up any memory. What it is eating up is battery. And so I always carry my phone charger in the boat with me, because otherwise you'll find yourself very quickly, as you're sorting through the pages and as you're looking at the app, you'll eat up the battery in your phone very quickly. But as long as you've got a means of charging it, you're good to go.
So all these new things coming up, are they going to be on the app, a part of the app?
Yeah, all these things are going to be widely available to the app. And again, if you're a lifetime member, you're going to get all of this stuff and you're not going to pay another penny. Or if you're not and you just want to purchase these things a la carte, you can do that as well. And that's kind of the cool thing about it, is a person can decide how much money they want to invest one way or another, whether they want to jump into this, you know, with one little toe in the pool, or whether they want to jump in with both feet in the deep end of the pool. Yes, sir.
So I know you've run the data with snap weights and tadpoles. Have you considered or done it with inline weights and crawler harness blades like a lot of people run?
Actually, it's already been done. We did that about 20 years ago. So we do have all of the common sizes of the snap weights and all the common sizes of the tadpoles are already included in the app. And that information is largely applicable to spinner fishing. Yes, that's where most people would use it. It's only been recently that people have been getting involved in using snap weights in combination with crankbaits. So we already have that out there. It's widely available, and we continue to expand to that.
So the snap weights, I'm looking at the app, the lowest you go down is a ½ ounce. I know a lot of people run lighter inline
Yes.
sinkers than that.
So there's room for improvement there. We can do the lighter size. By the way, you guys here on Lake St. Clair are the only people in the world that do that. Nobody else pulls spinners with less than a ½ ounce on them. I mean, everybody else is fishing in deeper water. But you guys are trying, I realize you're trying to pull over the top of the weed flats and stuff, so you're doing something special. But yes, it's very doable. We have the technology to do that. That can be expanded. And incidentally, if you wonder how we choose what we're going to test, it's conversations like we just had. When people contact me and say, this is something that I think is lacking in the app that I would find useful, I make a note of that, because honestly, I only make my money when you buy the app. So I don't want to test things y'all aren't using, because I don't make a penny doing that. So when I get feedback like this, it's invaluable, absolutely invaluable. And when we get a few people contacting me and say they need the same thing, that strikes a chord with me.
So you think the snap weight's equivalent to running a ½ ounce inline sinker with a crawler harness blade on it then?
No, not at all. I think that realistically, I think what we need to do is we need to do what you just said originally. We need to do a snap weight with a smaller weight on it, I think is what we need to do. I think that's the correct answer. Yep. Another question right here.
Where do we have to go to look at this app?
App, you can see it at the, if you're an Apple guy, of course, it's going to be the iTunes or the Apple App Store. If you're Android, it's Google Play is where you're going to go to see it there. And when you decide to purchase the app, you're going to get one free dive curve. And it's going to give you a chance to look at it. You can navigate it on your phone. You can see if you like it and stuff. And then you can move on from there. So you get one free lure. The lure you get is a flicker shad, a number 7 flicker shad, which happens to be a pretty popular walleye bait as well. And if that suits your fancy and you think that that's something that you're all excited about, then you can go and purchase as many pieces of the data as you want. Very good. This side of the room.
How many devices can you put that on? Like if you got a tablet and a phone?
As many as you want.
You put it on as many?
Yep. The only thing you can't do is you can't put it on a desktop computer or a laptop. And the reason you can't put it there is because then you'd be able to print it. And then if you'd be able to print it, then Mark would be out of business. I didn't just fall off the apple cart. So basically it's on personal devices. You can put it on as many personal devices as you want. So a tablet is okay, an iPad is okay, phones obviously are okay. And what a lot of people are doing these days, by the way, is let's say a guy jumps platform. Say he was an Apple guy and he jumped to an Android. If you don't get rid of your Apple phone and you still have your Apple ID, you can continue to upload data to that phone and keep it for as long as you want and use it for nothing more than storing your precision trolling data if that's what you choose to do. Guys that use the larger tablets are doing it because eyesight, because they don't want to look at a small phone app and have to put their reading glasses on to read the app. If it's in a larger format, obviously they can see it much easier. So there's no limit to how many devices you can put it on.
Can you transfer your, like I've got the app, and I decide to go to a tablet like you're talking about, can I take that license from my phone, put it on a tablet, or do I have to buy another license?
Nope, same license. As long as you're using the same ID, you're good to go. And that's where it gets a little tricky. With Apple, it's not a problem because you only have one ID with Apple. But with Google, it's very easy to have multiple IDs. If you've bought multiple phones, it's potential that you have multiple IDs. The ID you bought the data under, you can use that again and again and again to upload to any phone that you want, so long as you're using the right ID. And when people have problems, it's because they're using the wrong ID. They changed their ID and maybe didn't even realize it. I mean, you think about it, how many devices do we all own in our families nowadays? It's easy to understand how a person will get confused over that. Cool. Probably ought to hit, yeah. Jake said, we're never going to get any fishing here. All we're going to do is talk about apps. So let's talk really briefly about some of the things I think are fundamental that every walleye fisherman in this room should know and should be considering himself very skilled at, and then some of the directions where this is going to go in the future. If it was me and I wanted to catch walleye successfully everywhere I go, not just here on the St. Clair River or Lake St. Clair or Lake Erie to Detroit River, I would say that you need 3 presentations in your pocket. There's 3 presentations everybody in this room should be good at. You should be a good vertical jigger. You should be able to jig a river, and you should be effective at doing that and all of what that means. Boat control, and more boat control. You should also be able to fish a bottom bouncer and a spinner, and you should be able to fish it intelligently, not just in rivers like you do here, but also in open water fishing flats, Lake Erie, Saginaw Bay, even Lake St. Clair. Bottom bouncers are fundamental, are going to catch fish for you wherever you go. For many years, it was considered the moneymaker on the walleye tour because that was the rig that most people were cashing checks on. And the third thing is trolling crankbaits. If you are effective at trolling crankbaits and understand how to use planer boards, primarily inline planer boards, to get your baits out to the side, you can be extremely dangerous in this part of the world. You can catch all the walleyes your freezer will ever want. So those are the fundamental presentations you need to know. How things are changing in the future and where this is maybe will raise a few eyebrows here, some of the ways that you're going to look at is where I see this going in the future is casting jigs and swim baits, casting lipless cranks, and casting glide baits. This is where I see it becoming the big thing in the future. And if you don't have to be a mind reader to know this, all you have to do is follow the walleye tours. If you're following the National Walleye Tour or the Michigan Walleye Tour or even the Masters Walleye Circuit, if you follow any of these circuits, you're seeing that the guys who are dominating in these circuits these days are not trollers. That wasn't true a decade ago. The guys who are dominating in these circuits are the guys who are shallow water pitch fishermen. They're throwing lures to fish in shallow water and catching them. And they're using a variety of presentations. A jig with a paddle tail, very effective. Lipless crankbaits, things like rattle traps or the Rapala one is going to Rippin' wraps. Thank you, Jake. Rippin' wraps are really important in that regard. They're catching a ton of fish doing that. And then what I call glide baits. A glide bait would be something like a moonshine shiver minnow or a jigging wrap, those types of lures. Those types of presentations to shallow water are becoming very important. And the cool thing about this is that you can't be effective in shallow water unless you do a couple of things. One, you have to have faith that there's fish out there to go try. Most of us drive right over the shallow fish to go catch the fish we can see with our sonar in deep water. You're not going to see fish in shallow water with traditional sonar. If you don't have a side scan imaging device on your boat, if you can't see out away from the boat with down scan and side scanning, you're not going to be effective in shallow water. You need those kinds of tools. And when Jake comes to talk to you later in the year, he's going to get into that in much more detail. But just keep in mind that if you want to fish shallow, and I think it's a wave of the future, you cannot do it with broad beam sonar. You need to have some side scan imaging capability to be able to see that there actually are fish out there, that you're not just throwing blind. So those are going to be important things. And then jig trolling, we touched on it just briefly, but jig trolling with boards and swim baits. Imagine putting the crankbaits in the box and leaving them at home and trolling for walleyes with nothing more than jigs and paddle tails. This is going to be something in the future. It may not be this year, it may not be next year, it may not be necessarily even in the next 5 or 6 years, but in the long term, you're going to see this becoming a very important presentation. The one thing about jigs is that they're so natural in the water, fish cannot discern them from something good to eat. And crankbaits have a mechanical wiggle to them. No matter how you slice it, if you're like me and you've been fishing crankbaits your whole life, you've come to the conclusion that when fish are hot, when they want to eat, a crankbait gets the job done every day. But when the fish aren't hot and they don't want to eat, you can't force feed them a crankbait. They just won't go there, but they'll eat a jig in that same scenario. So in those times when you just can't get it done with a jig, or excuse me, when you can't get it done with a crankbait, you will be able to get it done with these paddle tails. How about some more questions? All the way to the back. I'm sorry.
You're feeling about...
Oh. Basically the same way that you would use a crankbait, except for a direct tie instead of a snap. And other than that, exactly the same way. I'm a mono guy. If you're a braid guy, you're going to have a fluorocarbon leader there. I recommend at least 6 foot of fluorocarbon as a leader if you want to troll jigs on, on braid. And a lot of guys will be all about the braid thing because when you're jig trolling, you're going slow. And when you're going slow, what you don't have in your corner is a hook set. In other words, the fish grabs that lure, and the only thing that's in your favor of actually hooking him is the fact that the braid doesn't stretch, and you get a pretty decent hook set as a result of that. Monofilament is probably not going to win the game in that situation because there's going to be at slow speeds, too much stretch, too much opportunity for the fish to come off before you can get that board off and come tight on that fish. Yeah, another question right here, sir. Sir.
The natural presentation, you're talking about the jigs and the mechanical crankbaits. What's your feeling then with, I'm always pulling meat, I'm using crawlers. That looks a lot like a rubber jig.
There's no way that fish will not eat a Nightcrawler. Fundamentally, that's why I put it in one of my, what I consider to be a fundamental presentation. A Nightcrawler harness with a blade catches fish everywhere. And I'm pretty fortunate in my life to be able to fish all the Great Lakes waters, many of the western waters, pretty much all the eastern waters, all of Ontario, most of the Canadian provinces. I haven't found a place yet where a walleye won't eat a Nightcrawler on a blade. As far as I'm concerned, it is fundamental. And so I don't think that's going to impact on your fishing at all. I think it's your fishing for that is going to be good forever. The only thing that hasn't happened in my lifetime is that you hear people giving lip service to taking a Nightcrawler harness and not putting a Nightcrawler on it, but putting an artificial worm or a plastic worm on it. Some of you may have had some success in that capacity. I've had zero. I have zero confidence in when it comes to that. Now, don't get me wrong. I'll put a plastic bait on a jig and toss it all day long. I'll put a Wyandotte worm down in the Detroit River with all the confidence in the world. But that Wyandotte worm is never going to make it on my crawler harness. It just doesn't seem to work as well as the God-given Nightcrawler does. So if somebody ever comes out with an artificial Nightcrawler that gets that job done, they're going to make a fortune on it. But I haven't seen it happen yet. Not in my lifetime, maybe in the lifetime of Jake and some of these other young guys here, but I have not seen anything that works better than a real Nightcrawler in that presentation. What else, folks? Over here.
That jig trolling, is it done with mainly paddle tails, or can split tails do it too? Or?
You could use anything you want. I think the paddle tail is going to be a dominant force just because of the action. I know that from casting jigs, and from vertical jigging in the rivers, quite honestly, the split tail is good. There's no question we catch a lot of fish on that, but the paddle tail seems to get bit, more often. And I think it displaces water, and the fish can feel it, and they sense it better. And so I think it has a little bit more action. So I think in general, from a trolling perspective, the paddle tail is probably going to outproduce the split tail.
What length are you going?
4, 5, and 6 inches. That's the other thing is that some of these plastics we're using are much larger than what we traditionally did. I grew up fishing a 3-inch twister tail. I almost never touch a 3-inch twister tail anymore. I've almost never touched a 3-inch anything anymore. Most of the soft plastics we're doing are 4 and 5 and even 6-inch. Yes, sir.
Are you going to run a stinger off that jig when you do that?
Well, only if you want to catch fish. So I've been quoted as saying this for a long time. I'm not a fan of stinger hooks because anyone who's ever fished them knows what a stinger hook does. It catches on everything in the boat. It catches on your gloves. It catches on the carpet. It's certainly going to catch in your landing net. It catches on stuff, and it's a pain in the butt to deal with a stinger hook. They are a royal pain in the butt. But if you're not using a stinger hook and you're fishing a jig, you're probably missing half your bites, maybe more. Jake and I were just on the Saginaw River here not too long ago, a couple days after Christmas, and we handled about 100 walleyes. And of that 100 walleyes, I bet there wasn't 10% had the hook in their mouth. All of them were caught on the stinger hook. And it just is what it is, especially in cold water. So, you know, as much as you may not like stingers and as much as you may complain about them, they're important. These days, we're not sticking the stinger in the plastic anymore. We used to do that. These days, we're just letting it dangle. And as a result, we tie our stingers on a little heavier line, about 17-pound. Fluorocarbon seems to work real good. So the stinger's got a little body. It's kind of hanging out there on its own, and it's positioned just above the tail of the paddle tail, or if the split tail, just above the split on the split tail. And that seems to work really, really well for us. There are other guys like Wyandotte worms and stuff who are running their stingers right straight through the worm. That's cool too. That works really good as well. But it's harder to do that with paddle tails, especially when you're doing what we do. We change out those paddle tails constantly. The sizes and the colors are being changed constantly. Yes, sir?
Are you using more of a ribster worm type paddle tail or a minnow type paddle tail?
No, all of them. I mean, if I could pick one brand, we like the Z-Man stuff. And the reason we're using the Z-Man stuff is it's super soft. I mean, like super soft. And so the tail's got action at the slightest possible movement. They're also impregnated with Procure, which makes them smell good, which makes them, you know, that much more enticing to fish as well. So we tend to be running the Procure stuff, but there's a lot of good ones out there. There's not just one or two paddle tails that work. Pretty much all of them work at one time or another. And our paddle tail collection is getting to be almost as big as our crankbait collection. So. I don't know how my time is. I've been wandering on here, so...
We got about 10, 15 minutes.
All right, I got a little bit more time, all right? So we can take a couple more questions. Yes, sir?
Now, do you ever use rattlers in your soft baits?
In the soft baits. That's a really good question. That kind of sound like some of you are bass fishermen at heart. Is that you do a lot of bass fishing? That sounds like something a bass fisherman would say. Because bass fishermen like, if it's a good presentation, it's only better with a rattle. That's their attitude. And quite frankly, as a walleye fisherman, I would have to tend to agree with that. I'll just back up for a second and say, oh, what about rattling crankbaits? There's a million of them to choose from. I've never seen a rattle be a bad thing. I've never seen it be a negative thing. I've never seen in my mind where a rattle prevents fish from biting. I have seen rattles entice fish into biting that wouldn't bite any other baits. For example, there's a lot of crankbaits that don't have rattles and some that do. In murky water conditions or dirty water conditions like we typically face here in the Great Lakes because of all the wind-driven sediment that we end up with, waves beating the shorelines to death and it gets muddy water, I would say that rattles are always going to be a positive thing. In a paddle tail, now we got a different story because a paddle tail isn't got a lot of wiggle or wobble to make that rattle shimmy or shake or make sound. So my concern is how would you do it? It would have to be all the way down by the paddle, because if it's up by the jig head, it's certainly not going to be moving much. But there are jigs out there, and I don't know if you've seen them or not. You guys fished the Storm 360 jigs yet? A Storm 360 jig is a jig with a little diving lip on the front of it, okay? And it gives that paddle tail a little bit more of this than you're used to. Now, if they added a rattle to that, or if you added a rattle to it, I think it would be game on. So, absolutely. Very intuitive. Good question, sir. Who else? Yes.
What about scent?
Well, I'm getting to be pretty biased about scent. I mean, there was a time in my life when I rarely used it. And I guess the way we explain scent is that, you know, we're multi-species fishermen at Fishing 401. We fish for a lot of different species. Clearly, walleye is our favorite, but you'll find us chasing trout and salmon a lot. Everybody I know who's a serious trout and salmon fisherman is also a scent fisherman. They believe in it. Science tells us that, you know, species of fish like Chinook salmon can smell in parts per billion. In other words, one drop of scent in an Olympic-sized swimming pool and a salmon can smell that. That's pretty impressive. I don't know how sensitive walleye are in terms of that. I don't know whether they've got those super sniffers on them that trout and salmon do. But I can tell you that our experience with using scent has been very positive. The problem with scent is that most people don't use it right. Most people are contaminating their lures right out of the get-go. So they're fishing with a lure that stinks because it's got the wrong odors in it. It's got something like our hand, the amino acids on our hand, L-serine that comes in our hands. Maybe you're a smoker, it's got tobacco smell. Maybe you filled up your boat on the way to the boat launch and your hands and your lures smell like gasoline. Maybe the bug bite is, or you know, the bugs are hatching like crazy and you got bug dope on You know, the list goes on and on. There's all kinds of unnatural things that end up getting on our lures. So if you're going to be successful at fishing scent, the first thing you have to do is make sure your lures are clean to start with. So you literally have to wash them. There's a couple ways you can do it. You can do it in dish detergent to get rid of the odors, or if you want, you can use chemical treatments like WD-40. Believe it or not, it sounds nasty, doesn't it? But WD-40 evaporates quickly after it's been used. So if you clean a lure with WD-40 and then rinse it, it virtually has no odor on it at all. Then at that point, once you have a lure that doesn't have any scent on it, put the scent on it and you'll be much more successful. The second part of the scent philosophy with us is that the stuff that people historically have used for scent, I have no idea why they do this. Anise. Why do people use anise for fishing scent? Correct me if I'm wrong, that's licorice, right? You're gonna hang a little piece of licorice on your lure and it's gonna get you more fish? It doesn't make any sense. Fish don't smell licorice as a natural part of their environment. Garlic is the other one. Garlic? Really? Really? Right. Yep. Those fish are all Italian. You know, they like garlic. I don't get those kinds of unnatural scents. But the majority of scents are that way. And then the third thing is water-soluble scents. Now, this was a genius that thought of this. All right? You buy a scent that's water-soluble, you squirt it on your lures. Where do your lures go? They go in the water. So the scent just washes away. So if you want to be successful, scent, in my opinion, it has to be natural. It has to smell like something good to eat. It has to smell like some kind of forage that these fish are used to. An emerald shiner, a gizzard shad, an alewife, a goby, whatever it is that they are naturally eating, that's what it needs to smell like. And it needs to be oil-based. It needs to actually stick on the darn lure. If it's water-based and it washes off, what the hell good is it? It's really a waste of your time and money. And so, yeah, if you do scent and you carry by those types of regiments, you will be successful, and I think you'll find that scent will be very successful for you. We use it all the time now, but we find it's way more productive early in the year and late in the year when the water is cold. The colder it is, the more fish are going to scrutinize your presentation because the slower their metabolism, the slower they're moving, they got more time to think about things. And so in the summertime, when they're reacting quickly and and baits are going past them at a high rate of speed, scent's not as critical. But this time of year, it's very critical, all through the winter, all through the spring. Yes, sir?
Does your app help with the clarity of the water? Are you telling us about it's murky? What's the depth?
No, unfortunately, the app doesn't really do much there. I can't help you there. That's going to be something that you do more from experience. And boy, we struggle with that all the time because, every day in the water, Jake and I, the very first thing we do when we get out in the water is we're looking over the back of the transom. Oh, God. We're wanting to try to determine how deep into the water we can see because that's going to determine what color lures that we end up running. If we have decent visibility and you can see the prop down there, we're going to be using some bright stuff, some chromes, some real flashy stuff that's got a lot of visibility in the water. If on the other hand, if you look over there and you can't see the prop, maybe you can't even see the cavitation plate, that's murky water and you're going to want something brighter. You're going to want a painted color, the fire tigers and some of these crazy fluorescent pinks and fluorescent purples and chartreuses that are becoming so popular on the custom-made crankbaits or custom-painted crankbaits. And so you're going to do that. It also dictates on the day that you're fishing. Bright days, sunny days, chromes are going to be better. Overcast, cloudy days, painted finishes are going to be better. Yes, sir?
Now, what do you think about the UV colors?
Well, this is going to get me in trouble because I know that people have said that walleye don't see in the UV spectrum, and that may be true, but I'm finding that UV colors seem to be more productive for us. The science will tell you that UV is more visible in low light conditions. So early in the day, late in the day, on overcast days, choppy days, UV is going to be better. Now we know it kicks butt with salmon and trout. So obviously they can see in UV, but I'm not sure why walleye may or may not be able to see in UV. Many of you probably know Ali, our local biologist guy, fishes in tournaments. He says that walleye can't see in UV spectrum, and I have a hard time denying anything that Ali says because I have a lot of respect for him. But we seem to catch more fish on UV baits than we do on plain painted baits, and I don't know what the explanation is other than that they can somehow see it. In fact, you can even buy, I don't know if you know this or not, but you can buy pure UV in a bottle. ProCure makes it, and you can shake it up and you can put it on any lure, whether it's UV painted or not, and it'll glow UV for about 30 minutes. So if you believe in that and you want to try it and you don't want to buy a whole bunch of lures that are UV painted, you can just buy the bottle of UV and apply it to the lures that you're having faith with, and do a scientific test of your own. Put it on one side of the boat, don't put it on the other side. See what gets bit more. You know, if you're getting bit more on the ones that have UV on it, then there's something to it. So that's a difficult one for me because it's now, for the most part, I think I'm pretty scientific based in my mind. But for whatever reason, it seems like we have had better luck with UV than without it. Good question.
I've used the UV for salmon. It works.
There's no question that salmon. There's no question that salmon it works for salmon, and part of that could be explained by the fact that salmon are typically caught in deeper water where light penetration is low. So as a result, anything that makes the lure more visible to them is going to be more productive. So that makes perfect sense there. Walleye are typically caught in shallow water where maybe UV is not as critically important. But I'll tell you one thing: it don't hurt. It don't prevent you from getting bites. That's for sure. So it's not hurting your fishing. I just can't say with 100% certainty that it's helping your fishing. So, what else? Probably time for maybe one or two more questions. Yes, sir.
Opinion on salted minnows versus live minnows for cold water jigging?
You know what? There was a day and time. That's a good question. Salted minnows or versus live minnows. There was a point in time when I thought you had to have the live minnow, you had to have the live wiggle in order to be successful. I don't necessarily think that's the case anymore. I think you could do just as well on a salted minnow or the dead floating minnow. What I have noticed though is that the problem with our minnows is we use emerald shiners for the most part. When an emerald shiner is alive, if you look at him, he's black on the top, he's bright silver on the side. I mean like penny, like dime bright on the side. Once he dies, his color completely changes. All of a sudden now he's more of a washed out white, and he doesn't look anywhere near the same. So his color has changed dramatically. So if you use a dead minnow and you're not getting bit on it, is it because the color has changed or because the minnow is not alive? So generally speaking, I would like preferably use the live minnows. But when you salt minnows, they keep their color. And so they look just exact, they're dead, but they look just exactly like they're live, and they work very well. They're also tougher, and they tend to stay on the hook a little bit better. So salting is not a bad thing. Yes, sir.
That's what we do with our minnows, our emeralds. We paint our coolers and our buckets or anything dark colors so they keep their color in it.
Correct. So they stay dark. And keep a lid on the bait bucket, and that's actually, I don't know if everybody picked up on that, but that's an old timer's trick that is absolutely wisdom. That's gospel, and I learned that back in my tournament days, and we never spoke of such things, and because we didn't want our competition to know that. But that's what keeps the minnows dark colored, is by having a dark bucket and a lid on them. Yes, sir.
That's another thing about this lake. Every fish in this lake eats worms. So you've got to have a lot of worms in when you run your crawler runs.
Hallelujah. Bait dealer loves us. Yes, sir.
Okay, speaking of worms, it always puzzled me that a worm is not natural to a lake. So apparently it must be just the scent that it's producing.
Maybe it's scent. That's a really good question, because I think it was Mike McClellan. Those of you that have followed tournaments over the years, Mike McClellan's retired now, but Mike McClellan was famous for saying the first Nightcrawler walleye ever sees is going to be his last. And he was absolutely right. It's not a very natural forage, although technically I guess it could be described. Worms get into tributary streams, they get washed down to the Great Lakes. So theoretically, a walleye could see a worm, but he's probably not seeing many of them. I don't know if it's the scent, or if it's the action, or if it's the combination of both. But what I do know is anybody who's ever touched a Nightcrawler knows that there's an earthy scent that is incredible there. And once it's on your hands, it's on your hands all day. I mean, you can wash your hands 4 times, and the next time you're reaching your hand in your lunch bucket and you're eating your sandwich, it's like, holy God, been fishing Nightcrawlers today. So I think it's probably a combination of both. But the action of a Nightcrawler is so subtle and so seductive that I think that's a big part of why plastic Nightcrawlers just don't work on a crawler harness. Yeah, Tim?
You had to choose one bait only. What is it?
Crankbait, you mean?
No, any bait, period.
All right, bottom bouncer and a spinner. So I mean, it's pretty hard to beat. Plus, I kind of, although I've made a very comfortable living as a troller, I kind of like having the rod in my hand. I like feeling fish bite and leaning on them. I mean, I just enjoy that. The fundamentals of it's so simple, anybody can do it. So a bottom bouncer and spinner is something I don't get to do nearly enough of. And I kind of like vertical jigging, and it's such a spring phenomenon here. We get to do it in the spring, but the rest of the year not so much. So, yep, if I could only choose one, it'd probably be a bottom bouncer and spinner. One last question, and then I got to quit, otherwise we'll never get out of here.
mentioned bottom bouncers. Always in contact with the bottom or just near the bottom, or I see some guys that'll actually put them behind boards and run them anywhere in the water column.
You know, there's no rhyme nor reason there. You know, a spinner on a bottom bouncer will get bit wherever it is in the water column, but clearly it's not efficient to fish it midway in the water column because you don't know where it's at. So you're fishing blind when you do that. But a bottom bouncer is kind of a misnomer. We don't fish them in contact with the bottom typically. We fish them in proximity to the bottom. So the way I set them is I get my boat speed going first. Once I know that my boat speed is correct, I can check it just by putting the spinner in the water. If the spinner is spinning nice, my boat speed is good. If my spinner is doing this, my boat speed's not fast enough. So once I get the speed set and stable, I don't want to, when you fish a bottom bouncer, you don't want to be speeding up and you don't want to be slowing down. You want to get the speed and stable. Then I'll go ahead and let it drop to the bottom and I'll let it go down slowly. Most people will free spool their bottom bouncers, and what happens is that the main line will get tangled with the harness. The harness will come back up and catch the main line. And so you're tangled right out of the get-go. So if you let it go down nice and slow and smooth, what will happen is eventually you'll feel it hit the bottom, or more importantly, you'll see it hit the bottom because the spool on your reel will stop spinning for a second. At that point, I just put my thumb on the spool and I just hold the rod. And I'm still trucking along at the same speed, nothing has changed. And then I'll start dropping back my rod tip and see if I can touch the bottom. And you'll notice that after a few seconds, you won't be able to touch the bottom anymore. What's happened is there's just enough friction in the line that the bouncer has moved up off the bottom. So then I take my thumb off the spool, I let it free spool again. Second time it hits the bottom, I hit it in gear, and that is it. I don't touch it again. It's not magic and it's not rocket scientists. If you're spending too much time adjusting your bottom bouncers, you're probably going to struggle with that presentation. So where is that actually running? It's hitting the bottom and it's skipping off the bottom for several yards, ticking the bottom, skipping, ticking the bottom. So it's in proximity to the bottom, just every once in a while, occasionally touching the bottom. And as long as that blade is traveling over the bottom within a foot of the bottom, you're going to catch a pile of fish on a bottom bouncer. That's all it is. Anybody can master it. Tim, I bet you want the mic back. Thank you very much, folks. I appreciate your attention.
Thank you, Mark.